They said the house was born from blood before it ever tasted breath, long before the walls were painted white and the columns rose like the bones of giants. The land beneath it had already learned how to swallow screams. When construction began in the early 1800s, it wasn't carpenters and craftsmen who raised the beams. It was hands bound by ownership, backs split by the whip, and voices that dared not speak above a whisper. The house did not simply stand on southern soil. It was fed to life by those who would never sleep in its rooms, never sit at its table, never be remembered by name. Some claimed the first ghost arrived before the roof was even built. A young boy, no older than 12, had collapsed while hauling lumber across the muddy yard. The overseer did not stop the work. 2 men were ordered to drag the body aside so his weight wouldn't slow down the day. They left him at the edge of the trees, and by dusk his body was gone. No grave was dug, no prayer was spoken, only the sound of a nightbird circling above the spot where his blood soaked into the roots. When the house was finally complete, its facade shone like polished ivory in the sun. The master took pride in his estate, calling it Hollowbrook Hall, a name that would someday vanish from the maps, but not from the whispers that replaced it. The rooms were tall, with ceilings made to impress wealthy guests, but the walls seemed to breathe differently at night. Doors creaked without wind, floors shifted as though remembering footsteps that never officially existed, and sometimes servants swore the sound of dragging chains echoed under the floorboards even when no one was below. Those who slept inside the house, the owners and their lineage, never knew real silence. Even in moments of laughter, music, and lantern-lit dinners, something pressed against the edges of sound like a hidden breath waiting to exhale. The enslaved workers who labored in the fields and kitchens kept their heads lowered, but among themselves, when darkness protected their words, they said the house had eyes. They said it saw everything done in its name, and it never forgot. One stormy night, not long after the family settled in, a woman named Lottie, forced to work in the master's chambers, heard soft footsteps in the upstairs hallway. She assumed another servant had been summoned, but when she stepped out with a candle, she saw a child's silhouette at the end of the corridor, small, barefoot, still. She whispered to him, asking who he belonged to, but he did not respond. The flame of her candle flickered just once, and in that single blink, he was gone. No door opened, no floorboard creaked, just absence, thick and cold. By morning, Lottie told no one. To speak of such things meant punishment, and she already carried scars enough. But another servant, an older man named Jonah, caught her glancing at the hallway with wide eyes later that day. Without looking at her directly, he murmured, "Sometimes the ones left outside try to come in." He said nothing more. The house continued to grow in reputation before it ever grew old. Travelers passing by on horse-drawn wagons swore that lights flickered in the windows long after the occupants went to sleep. A peddler once claimed he saw a shadow moving across the veranda at dawn, even though the doors were locked and no one had risen yet. Locals brushed it off with nervous laughter, calling it superstition, but the enslaved people who worked the land did not laugh. They had their own word for the house, one they whispered in Gullah and broken English, the wakeful place, a place where the dead remembered the living. Within only a few years, Hollowbrook Hall had swallowed more lives than it could count. Men crushed under timber, women beaten for slowing under the sun, children lost to fever and exhaustion. Their bodies were buried shallow, if at all, behind the slave quarters or among the trees. The earth there was restless, as though it refused to hold what had been thrown into it. On humid nights, the soil seemed to breathe. Even the master's family was not untouched by unease. His wife, a delicate woman with lace gloves and trembling hands, often suffered insomnia. She confessed to her sister in a letter that she felt watched as she slept, as if someone stood beside the bed in the dark. The sister replied that it was only the toll of managing a great estate. But no estate, no matter how grand, should sigh in the night like something alive. Every servant knew the sound of the floors whispering under unseen steps. They learned to ignore the rustle of skirts in empty rooms, the click of a latch in a corridor no one entered, the quiet sob of a child that came and went with no source. And yet they endured. For people who lived under bondage, fear of spirits was a softer fear than the fear of men. Still, there was one rule that everyone followed, even though no one had spoken it aloud. No one looked too long into the mirrors after sunset. The house had several, positioned by the master's wife for elegance, but reflections did not always match the living. Some swore they saw figures standing behind them, blurred shapes with hollow eyes. Others, braver or more desperate, draped cloth over the glass once the lamps were out. By the time the house turned 10 years old, it had ceased belonging to the living alone. Its walls soaked in whispers, its floors held footsteps that no longer had bodies, and its windows stared like eyes that never closed. Those who worked there said quietly that the boy who vanished behind the trees never truly left, that he was only the first to return. The house never slept, and those who entered it forgot what rest felt like. Long before the house gained its reputation among outsiders, it was the enslaved who first understood that something beneath its polished floors would not stay silent. They lived closest to the land, and the land remembered more than the owners cared to admit. Each night, when the fields went dark and the last chores were done, the quarters filled with hushed voices and tired breathing. Yet even then, no one ever said the house was quiet. It breathed with them, beside them, around them, as though the walls had lungs and the rooms had veins. One evening, a young girl named Tessa was sweeping the main hall after the family retired upstairs. The lamps along the corridor burned low, their flames pale and trembling as if unsure of themselves. She bent to gather dust near the base of the staircase when a faint tapping sounded behind the wall beside her, soft, quick, like knuckles brushing wood from the other side. She froze, broom midair. The tapping stopped. After a moment, she convinced herself it was mice or branches and resumed. Then it came again, this time slower, deliberate. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. The rhythm was too human to ignore. She backed away without turning her back to the sound, dragging the broom with her. The next morning, she told no one. But later that day, while drawing water, an older woman noticed her shaken expression. Without asking a question, she said, "Walls don't keep secrets. They only hold them till someone listens." Tessa said nothing, but her eyes widened in acknowledgement. There was no comfort in being understood when fear was a shared language. The slaves who worked inside the house noticed the voice of the building more than those who owned it ever would. Doors that should have stayed shut drifted open just enough for shadows to cross. A rocking chair in an unused nursery would creak as if someone invisible rocked with grief too heavy to speak aloud. Once, a cook claimed she heard humming in the pantry just before dawn, a lullaby not sung in over 20 years, from a tongue nearly erased by force. She swore it was a song her mother sang before she was sold as a child. No one contradicted her. Visitors, rare as they were, sometimes felt the presence too. A cousin of the master came to stay one summer, boasting loudly about his own estate and his disdain for superstition. On his second night, he burst into the breakfast room pale and wild-eyed, insisting that someone had walked across his room while he lay in bed. He heard the boards groan under the weight and saw a shadow pass near the fireplace, though no servant had been summoned and no draught disturbed the curtains. The master laughed it off, but his wife lowered her gaze, saying nothing. She had heard the same steps months before but dared not speak of it to a man who believed silence was obedience. Not all spirits were seen, or heard, within the main walls. Behind the house stood old storage sheds and smokehouses that hid their own memories. Some descendants believed these structures were more haunted than the halls themselves, because the dead clung hardest to the places where they suffered most. A man named Elias once vanished for nearly an hour after entering the shed to fetch tools. When he returned, soaked in sweat and trembling, he claimed he heard voices calling his name from beneath the floor, voices of people he once knew, long buried but restless. No one mocked him. Some refused to enter that shed ever again. The master's children, too innocent to fear what they could not name, sometimes mentioned the quiet boy who walked near the back stairs or sat on the steps at dusk. They said he never spoke or came close, but watched them with eyes that didn't match the living. A tutor overheard their talk one afternoon and scolded them for inventing nonsense. But that same night, she woke to find her bedroom door wide open, though she remembered closing it firmly before blowing out her candle. In the servant quarters, where rest was a luxury and nightmares were often memories, the hauntings were not always met with terror. Some believed the spirits were not warnings but witnesses. They said the dead lingered not to harm but to remind, to push back against the silence forced upon them. Still, there were nights when even the bravest among them drew their beds away from the walls. The wood creaked too much, as though someone leaned against it from inside, waiting for acknowledgement. One winter evening, when the air held the bitter chill of approaching frost, a group of workers gathered near the hearth in the kitchen after finishing their late tasks. The fire cast long shadows along the floor, flickering against their faces. Out of nowhere, a sharp crack echoed from the parlor, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The house staff rushed to see what had happened, expecting a fallen lantern or broken vase. But nothing was disturbed, except for one mirror above the fireplace. A fracture ran through it like a lightning bolt, splitting the reflection in two, as though the glass refused to show one world without the other. From that night on, the mirror was covered with cloth, and no one asked why. What made the house different from any other southern estate was not just the cruelty that built it, but the memories that refused burial. The enslaved people had no gravestones, no eulogies, no prayers spoken aloud in their names, but the walls heard everything, the beams remembered every blow, and the floorboards carried the weight of every last breath. Even those who denied such things could not ignore the way the wind changed when it crossed the threshold. It did not simply move through the trees or brush past chimneys. It paused, as though listening too. The house did not sleep, because suffering does not fade just because the world forgets it. Long before tourists craned their necks to glimpse its broken windows and darkened corridors, the residents of the plantation whispered about noises that had no source, shadows that stretched where no one stood, and cold drafts that swept across rooms even in the thick of a southern summer. Field hands spoke of footsteps pacing the upper floors long after the master retired for the night, as though memories themselves walked the hallways, refusing to settle. The main house had always been more than wood and brick. It was a container of voices pressed into its walls, too heavy to dissolve into the past. They said that at night the house groaned like something alive. Floorboards creaked with the weight of invisible movement. Doors that were bolted shut at sundown were sometimes found ajar by morning, their hinges whispering as though touched by hands that no longer had form. One maid, a girl barely 16, swore she heard soft tapping on the window panes after midnight. But when she drew the curtains aside, nothing stood outside except the empty, moon-soaked veranda and the dark mass of the trees. She quit the next day without giving a reason. Her mother refused to let her return, claiming the house held eyes that could still see. In the slave quarters, they told stories not to frighten each other, but to explain what could no longer be ignored. Some said the spirits of the dead stayed close because they had never been given rest. Others believed the house itself was cursed, feeding off the misery that had taken place beneath its roof. A child once claimed to see a woman in a faded dress standing in the hallway near the back staircase. When asked what the woman looked like, the child only said she was looking for her breath. No one pressed further. Children, after all, could see things that adults had trained themselves to ignore. The master of the plantation dismissed every tale with the wave of his hand. He believed voices came from the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, and that footsteps were nothing more than the house adjusting to the night air. Yet even he could not ignore everything. More than once he was roused from sleep by the faint sound of humming, low, mournful, and without words, rising through the floorboards as though the house itself was trying to remember a song it was not meant to sing. On such nights, he would sit upright in the darkness, his chest tight with a nameless unease, and listen until the humming stopped. The enslaved men and women moved quietly through their days, carrying the weight of fear like another chain. They understood that silence did not mean peace. They knew that pain, when not buried properly, could linger like smoke trapped in a room with no windows. Some tried to bless the spaces they slept in by marking the doorframes with symbols handed down through generations. Others whispered prayers in languages the overseers did not recognize, calling upon ancestors to keep the restless dead at bay. But not all spirits were mournful. Some were angry. There were nights when lanterns flickered without wind, when tools left neatly stacked outside the barn were found scattered by morning as though flung in rage. One overseer claimed he heard breathing behind him while walking the grounds after dark. When he turned, he saw no one, yet the sound persisted, close enough to stir the hair on the back of his neck. He refused to patrol alone after that, and began carrying a Bible in his coat pocket, though he had never opened it before. Despite the unease, life on the plantation went on, driven by the demands of harvest and profit. The living had little choice but to continue working under the weight of those who could not leave, and the house, all relentless and watching, stood as a silent witness to every secret it held. It did not sleep because time had never truly moved forward for it. Every night folded into the next, every memory curled into the corners like dust that could not be swept away. Even the animals sensed what humans tried to dismiss. Horses balked at being tied near the back entrance of the house, ears pinned and eyes rolling white. Dogs that wandered too close whined and backed away, tails tucked low as if they had heard something growl from behind the walls. The air near the old kitchen door always felt colder, even in July. Some believed that was where the first soul had been taken, though no one could agree on whose it was. And through it all, the land itself seemed to listen. The trees leaned in, branches scratching against the upper windows on windless nights. The ground, once soaked with sweat and blood, held on to echoes that could not be buried. The house had become a vessel of the unresolved, a monument to stories that were never allowed to end. Those who lived there learned to move quietly, to speak softly, and to avert their gaze when the shadows shifted. Because in a place where the dead are not at rest, sleep is a luxury the walls themselves have forgotten. By the time the war crept across the South, like a sickness no one could stop, the house had already gathered more ghosts than names on the family Bible. The men who had once strutted through its halls with polished boots and silver-tipped canes began to speak in lower tones, as if the walls were listening and waiting to repeat their fears back to them at night. Soldiers passed through the region, some stopping for water, others for shelter, and a few unlucky ones for their final breath. The house absorbed their presence the way dry earth absorbs rain, silently, without choice, leaving only traces behind. There was a night when wounded men were brought to the parlor, the furniture shoved aside to make space for cots and blood-soaked bandages. Lanterns burned low, casting warped shadows on the ceiling as surgeons worked with trembling hands and dull instruments. Groans mingled with prayers, and more than one dying man claimed to see figures drifting between the rooms, watching with hollow eyes. One soldier tried to rise from his cot, wild with terror, insisting that someone was standing at the foot of his bed. When the lantern was raised, nothing stood there but the imprint of footsteps in the dust, as though someone barefoot had been waiting and walked away only after being seen. After the soldiers moved on, the house stood quieter for a time, but the quiet was not peace. It was the pause between breaths. The blood that had seeped into the floorboards never truly dried. On humid nights, it was said that the scent of iron rose faintly in the parlor, curling through the air like a warning. The enslaved who scrubbed the floors claimed the stains reappeared no matter how hard they worked, darkening the wood in patterns that resembled hands or faces if stared at too long. The mistress of the house forbade them from speaking of it, but even she stepped carefully when crossing that room after sundown. As the war dragged on, hunger and uncertainty turned the land sour. Supplies grew scarce, tempers shorter, and the fields were left untended in places where the soil had always demanded labor. Some enslaved families attempted escape under the cover of night, but the woods were treacherous and patrols doubled as fear spread among the locals. Those who were caught were dragged back in silence, their eyes carrying more ghosts than their bodies ever could, and the house, towering and patient, recorded every scream that was not allowed to echo. There were rumors of a night when 3 children disappeared from the quarters. Their mother searched the fields barefoot, calling their names until her voice broke, but no one answered. Some believed they had run toward the river, hoping to find safety on the other side. Others whispered that the house had taken them, that something within its bones called out to the lost and the small, luring them the way light lures a moth. A week later, the eldest child was found sitting on the back steps at dawn, covered in dirt and staring at nothing. He could not or would not speak. When someone tried to lift him, he flinched as if touched by fire. The master, hardened by war and weariness, began locking his bedroom door from the inside. He claimed it was to keep thieves out, but his wife knew better. She had woken one night to the sound of someone sobbing in the hallway, a low, broken sound that faded the moment she lit her candle. She followed the noise to the stairs and saw, just for a moment, the figure of a woman in a tattered dress standing at the landing. The air around the figure shimmered like heat above a flame, then vanished as though swallowed by the dark. For weeks afterward, the mistress avoided the staircase after sunset, choosing instead to sleep in a smaller room on the ground floor with the door bolted shut. Some tried to explain the hauntings as stress, hunger, or imagination, but even the most practical minds began to bend. Farmhands refused to go near the old smokehouse after dusk, claiming they heard chains dragging across the dirt when no one was near. A midwife who came to deliver a child swore she heard whispering in the nursery before the baby had even taken its first breath. She left before sunrise and never returned, telling her husband that the house was listening, and she would not risk being there when it decided to speak back. The house did not care who believed in it or who denied it. It was not waiting for permission to remember. Every secret, every cry, every drop of blood and breathless silence had built its foundation deeper than the roots of the trees surrounding it. The war outside only fed what was already festering within. The living might come and go, but the dead had found a place to settle, and they clung to it like ivy to the crumbling brick. Even when the cannons grew distant and the world beyond the fields began to change, the house remained what it had always been, a keeper of unfinished stories. It did not sleep because sleep requires forgetting, and forgetting was something it was never built to do. And with each passing night, the line between the ones who remained by choice and the ones who remained because they could not leave thinned like smoke in a closed room, waiting for the moment someone dared to breathe it in. When the war finally ended, it did not bring peace to the house, only a new kind of silence. The fields, once crowded with bodies forced into labor, stood strangely bare. Tools rusted in the dirt where they had been dropped, and the wind moved through the empty rows like a whisper searching for someone to hear it. The enslaved were told they were free, but freedom in a land that had swallowed generations of suffering did not feel like release. Many left with nothing but their names and the clothes on their backs, walking away from the place where their ancestors had bled into the soil. Others stayed because they had nowhere else to go, or because the graves of their kin held them in ways the law could not break. The house did not adjust to this change. It had grown accustomed to the rhythm of footsteps, the scrape of buckets, the murmurs of prayer at dawn and dusk. Now the halls felt hollow, and the walls absorbed the emptiness the way they once absorbed breath. The mistress, her hair streaked with gray and her face carved with something deeper than age, wandered the rooms like a ghost among ghosts. Her husband, thinner now and slower in his speech, spent long hours sitting on the porch, staring out at the land, as though waiting for it to rise up and tell him what to do. But the house did not rest simply because the world outside shifted. Nights became heavier, as though the dark itself pressed against the windows. Doors that had remained still for months began to creak open again, and the sound of footsteps returned to the upper floors even though most of the rooms stood empty. Sometimes faint voices drifted through the corridors, soft, unfinished phrases in accents long buried, words too old to belong to the living. It was said that a mirror in one of the guest rooms fogged from within, as though someone without lungs still tried to breathe. Travelers passing through the region spoke of the house in hushed tones. Some claimed to see flickering lights in the windows, though no lamps were lit. Others swore they heard music, low, mournful hymns carried on the wind near the back veranda. A few were invited to stay the night by the aging mistress, who insisted she could not bear the emptiness alone. Most refused politely, giving reasons that sounded practical, but were rooted in something far older than manners. One man, a peddler with a bad leg, accepted the offer and slept in a room facing the old oak tree. He awoke before dawn to find his bed trembling, as though something beneath the floorboards was moving. When he placed his feet on the ground, he felt the boards pulse beneath his skin like a heartbeat. He left before breakfast, limping faster than he had in years, and told anyone who would listen that the house was alive and did not want anyone sleeping within it. The few formerly enslaved families who remained nearby avoided the grounds after sunset. They still remembered too much the cries that had echoed through the night, the punishments carried out in the yard, the faces of those who were buried without name or prayer. One elderly woman, whose mother had been born in the quarters behind the house, spoke of a shadow that sometimes appeared in the doorway of the old kitchen. She said it looked like a man standing with his hands bound, but when the light changed, it vanished, leaving only the smell of smoke and iron. Animals continued to sense what people tried to deny. Crows gathered on the chimneys, sometimes in such numbers that the roof shingles disappeared beneath their claws. Horses taken past the front gate reared or bolted without warning, their eyes rolling white as if they saw something standing in the doorway. Even the insects avoided certain corners of the house, as though the air there was too dense for wings to move. As the years crept on, the plantation lands were divided, sold, or left to decay. But the house remained anchored by what it had witnessed. New owners came and went, each hoping to tame the shadows with paint, candles, or prayer. None stayed long. Some claimed illness drove them away. Others refused to speak of their reasons. A few left in the middle of the night, abandoning furniture and clothing, as though chased out by something that did not need a name. And still, the house did not sleep. Its memory ran too deep, its walls too full of voices that had never been heard. The living grew older, and their stories faded, but the stories of the dead clung to the wood and the earth beneath it like roots that refused to die. No one could say how many souls still moved through its halls, or how many more would join them before the house finally decided it was enough. Time did not heal the house. It only layered dust over the evidence of what had already been carved into its bones. Decades passed, and the world beyond the plantation reinvented itself with factories, railroads, and laws that pretended memory could be rewritten. But the house stood unchanged, gripping the earth with its foundation like a hand unwilling to release what it held. The paint peeled, the shutters loosened, and ivy crawled up its sides as though the land itself was trying to swallow it whole. Yet even as nature crept over the walls, the presence inside remained sharp and awake, as though decay only made more room for the dead to move. A man named Harlan took possession of the property after buying it at auction for a price so low it felt like theft. He claimed to see opportunity where others saw ruin, dreaming of restoring the estate into a grand boarding house or retreat. Locals warned him without warning, speaking in riddles and glances rather than words. He dismissed their unease as superstition clinging to old soil. With contractors and tools in tow, he pried open the doors that time had tried to seal shut, forcing light into rooms that had not seen the sun in years. But the light did not settle easily. Workers reported echoes where there should have been silence, and cold drafts rising from floorboards untouched by wind. One man, sent to clear debris from the upper hallway, came rushing down the stairs, died and pale, refusing to return. He claimed he heard breathing behind him, slow, deliberate, and too close to be imagined. Another laborer found his tools moved each morning, arranged in careful rows on the parlor floor, as though someone had laid them out like offerings or warnings. Harlan tried to dismiss the stories, but even he could not ignore everything. In the middle of one humid afternoon, he heard a door slam upstairs, though no one else was in the house. When he went to check, he found the room empty, dust swirling in the air, as though something unseen had just moved through it. He laughed it off when speaking to others, but that night, he slept in his wagon instead of the bedroom he had prepared. As repairs continued, more unsettling discoveries surfaced. Loose floorboards revealed small bones too old to be from animals that still roamed the land. A section of the cellar wall crumbled to expose a narrow space that smelled of earth and rusted metal, with shackles still bolted into the stone. One worker swore he heard chains dragging in that space even after the room was cleared and the entrance sealed. He quit the next day without collecting his pay. Harlan's plans began to fray as funds dwindled and fear crept into the edges of his resolve. Nights on the property stretched long, filled with strange knocks that seemed to travel through the walls, like a message sent in a code only the house understood. The air in some rooms felt thick, pressing against the lungs until breathing became labor. He found himself speaking aloud when alone, as though something unseen was listening and waiting for a response. One evening, he lit a fire in the hearth of the main parlor, hoping warmth might soften the chill that clung to the house even in summer. As the flames rose, shadows gathered at the edge of the light, not cast by furniture or walls, but by something that seemed to stand between the fire and the air itself. He watched frozen, as the shape pulsed and then faded. When he blinked, the fire crackled as though nothing had happened. But he did not sit again. He remained standing near the doorway until the embers died. Word spread quietly that the house was rejecting him. Neighbors, who had once mocked the idea of hauntings, began avoiding the road that passed near the gate. Children were warned not to wander close, though none needed convincing. Even animals that strayed onto the property did not linger, leaving hoof prints in the dirt that veered sharply away from the house, as though redirected by unseen hands. Harlan stayed longer than most would have, but endurance is not the same as belonging. One morning, his wagon was found loaded with belongings, the doors of the house left wide open behind him. No one saw him leave, but the marks of departure were clear. He did not try to sell the property again. He simply stopped speaking of it altogether, as though the very memory had to be put down like a wounded animal. The house remained, untouched once more, its windows staring blankly at the world it refused to release. It had swallowed families, soldiers, and workers alike, and still, its hunger lingered just beneath the floorboards. Sleep was still foreign to it. Rest was still denied. And whatever had stirred during the war, and long before it had not gone quiet, it had only been waiting for the next name to carve into the silence. Years slipped by like breath on glass, but the house remained a wound that never scarred. Vines thickened around its pillars, the roof sagged like a tired spine, and storms peeled away shingles with the patience of something reclaiming what was once stolen. Yet through every season of abandonment, the structure stood with a stubbornness that felt less like strength and more like defiance. Those who lived in nearby towns avoided speaking of it directly, referring instead to that place past the creek, or the one that never empties. The name of the family who built it was forgotten by most, but the memory of what happened there was not. Hunters passing near the property told of hearing voices stitched into the winds, faint, layered, and impossible to trace. Some swore they saw figures in period clothing crossing the yard at dusk, vanishing before their feet touched the porch. One hunter found a child's shoe half, buried in the mud behind the smokehouse, still rigid with age, but shaped as though it had only recently been worn. He left it where it was, unwilling to carry someone else's sorrow in his pocket. As decades turned to nearly a century, nature began to wrap its roots around the foundation stones. But roots cannot smother what breathes without lungs. Travelers who camped too close woke in the night to find their fires extinguished, and their names whispered back to them in voices not their own. A pair of teenagers once dared each other to spend a night inside, entering through a broken window when the sun dipped low. They lasted 2 hours. One ran screaming into the woods, convinced something had touched his shoulder in the dark. The other was found at dawn sitting on the steps, shaking and unable to explain why his hands were covered in soot. Locals claimed that the house had moods, days when it stood silent and watchful, and nights when it seemed to exhale grief so heavily that the very air around it trembled. A preacher once tried to bless the grounds, his Bible pressed against his chest as he circled the property. As he neared the old staircase, he heard a voice speak a name he did not know, and the page under his fingers went cold as if carved from stone. He left before finishing his prayer and never returned, though he told his congregation that some places were not meant to be reclaimed by the living. In a nearby town, a schoolteacher with a fondness for history collected stories about the house. She interviewed elders whose grandparents had once worked the fields or cleaned its halls, piecing together accounts whispered across generations. Many refused to speak above a murmur, glancing over their shoulders even in daylight. One woman, nearly blind with age, said she remembered her own grandmother waking at night to the sound of a baby crying in the walls, even though no infants had lived in the house for years. Another recalled hearing chains rattle beneath the floorboards whenever rain soaked the earth. The teacher wrote down every word but felt the weight of something she could not see pressing between each page. She walked the property once, standing at the edge of the overgrown path, but did not step closer. The air smelled of damp wood and old breath, and she sensed that the house was aware of her presence in a way that chilled her to the bone. She left before dusk, and every note she took afterward bore the tension of someone trying not to look over her shoulder. Though the world outside modernized, bringing roads, power lines, and new names, the land around the house resisted intrusion. Surveyors who attempted to map the area found their compasses spinning, their instruments failing without explanation. A crew sent to clear the surrounding brush abandoned the job when their equipment malfunctioned 3 days in a row, and one of them claimed to see a figure staring at him from an upper window that had no glass. And so the house stood in its isolation, untouched by progress and unclaimed by time. It did not crumble entirely, nor did it invite collapse. It lingered with purpose, as though waiting for someone specific, or something that had not yet come. The ghosts within it, whether born of memory or misery, did not drift aimlessly. They moved with intention through corridors that once echoed with orders, prayers, and the quiet resignation of those who had no voice to raise. The house remained their world, and the world beyond its steps dared not enter without consequence. As the decades rolled forward, the world beyond the estate changed in ways the house could neither ignore nor fully reject. The Civil War had scarred the South, and whispers of progress drifted like cautious birds over the treetops. Yet the mansion, with its shuttered windows and guarded silence, clung to the memory of its own reign. Those who had once served its halls were long gone, either freed by force or fate, but the house behaved as if they had never left. Shadows still crossed the balconies at dusk. Lantern-like glows appeared in windows that no one had opened in 50 years. By the time the 1900s crept in, the town around Hawthorne Parish had pushed forward into a new era. Rail lines, telegraph poles, and chatter of industries shaping the land. Still, few dared mention the property by name. Stories passed through generations like family silver no one wanted to polish. Children were warned never to follow the road that disappeared behind the cottonwood grove. Even grown men avoided speaking of what had been seen there. A rocking chair shifting on its own, drapes stirring behind sealed glass, a low hum on windless nights that sounded almost like a hymn half remembered. One summer evening, a group of railway surveyors set up camp near the far boundary of the property. They were outsiders, unaware of the unspoken rules of the place. As darkness pooled, they noticed faint lights moving across the grounds, too steady to be fireflies, too many to be lanterns. One man claimed he saw a figure standing on the veranda, its outline sharp against the moonlight, its face obscured. When the group returned to town the next morning, they spoke quietly about what they'd witnessed. The elders listened, said nothing, and simply shook their heads as if another warning had been written in the air. Meanwhile, the house seemed to sense that time was testing its grip. Floors that had once groaned under the weight of residents now creaked for no reason at all. Doors opened and shut like lungs drawing breath. Some nights, the old piano in the parlor released a cluster of notes as though an invisible hand rested briefly on its keys. The echoes did not sound mournful. They sounded territorial, as if the house reminded itself it was not empty, would never be empty. Nature itself appeared unwilling to reclaim the land. Vines slithered up the stone, but never wrapped themselves fully around it. Birds would circle the chimneys, yet rarely nested beneath the eaves. When storms broke across the region, lightning struck nearby trees but always seemed to bend away from the house, as if redirected by something unseen. Those who lived nearest the property told of dreams, long, unsettling visions of wandering candlelight, footsteps on upstairs landings, and a voice calling from a place both close and unreachable. Even those who had never stepped foot beyond the thresholds felt as though the mansion watched them from a place just past memory. It wasn't merely a building, it had become a boundary, and still no one claimed it. Titles vanished. Paperwork was lost. Every attempt to catalog old estates in the region skipped its entry like a line erased from history. Yet its presence was as real as the church bell in town or the river that cut through the valley. It waited as it always had, silent, watching, and utterly awake. Though the world insisted on moving forward, the house held the past like a fist that would never unclench. Anyone who glimpsed it from the road knew with bone, deep certainty, whatever lived there would not fade. The house did not sleep. It remembered. By the time the mid-century settled over the South, people treated the mansion like a myth with teeth, spoken of quietly, avoided deliberately. Yet curiosity has a way of outlasting fear, especially among those who believe legends lose power with disbelief. It was in the late 1950s when two brothers from a distant county arrived with the idea of purchasing and restoring old Southern estates. They had money, confidence, and no sense of the boundary they were approaching. They found the property by following the overgrown road locals refused to acknowledge. From a distance, the house appeared weathered but standing firm, its columns stained by time but unbroken. The brothers walked the perimeter, speaking of renovations and potential buyers, imagining chandeliers and polished staircases. They laughed at the idea of ghosts, called the stories inheritance of superstition. The land listened. On their second day exploring the grounds, one of them spotted what he thought was a doorway ajar on the second floor, though no entrance should have been visible from the outside. As he pointed it out, the gap vanished, as if the wood had never moved. They convinced themselves it was a trick of shadow and sun. But when evening came, they camped just beyond the tree line and heard footsteps cross the porch, slow and unhurried. No wind, no animals, just the measured creak of someone moving with purpose. At dawn, they approached the front steps again, more cautious this time. The air smelled like old wood smoke and something sweeter, like magnolia, though no trees bloomed nearby. One of the brothers reached for the doorknob and felt a sharp coldness shoot up his arm, as if metal and memory had fused together. He jerked back, shaken but unwilling to admit it. They circled the house instead, searching for a cellar or servants' quarters, anything that might justify the creaks and sounds of life they'd heard. Before noon, an elderly man from the nearest farmstead, appeared at the edge of the property. He did not cross the threshold of the land. He stood with his hat in hand and called out, "You boys done walking in circles yet?" His voice held no welcome, only warning carved into patience. When they approached to speak with him, he never stepped forward. He told them plainly that no one bought the house because no one truly left with it. Titles disappeared, fortunes dried, and those who tried to take it ended up with nothing but whispers chasing them home. They laughed him off in the moment, but neither returned to the porch that day. That night, as they tried to sleep in their truck under the cottonwoods, they heard the piano, 3 notes, clear as breath against glass. Not a ghost story told by others, not imagination. Sound carried on still air from a house that should have been empty for a century. By morning, they packed their things in silence. One refused to look back. The other, just as they pulled onto the main road, glanced over his shoulder. He swore later he saw a curtain lift on the 2nd floor, and behind it, the faint silhouette of someone watching. Someone who had always been there. They never filed a deed, never returned, and though they spoke of their experience only in half-truths, both agreed on one thing: it wasn't abandonment that haunted the mansion, it was occupancy, unseen, unchanging, and older than anything living could understand. The house had outlasted war, time, and memory. It did not ask for owners. It did not accept them. It remained exactly what it had become: awake, inhabited, and unwilling to be claimed. By the time the modern age crept into the region with paved roads, cell towers, and satellite maps, the mansion had already decided its relationship with the world. It would be seen only by those it allowed, and remembered only by those it touched. Locals stopped trying to warn outsiders. The stories had become so old and tangled that even those who believed them spoke as if reciting something inherited, not learned. And yet, every generation produced at least one soul who felt the pull of forgotten things: historians, thrill-seekers, preservationists, wanderers who trusted fascination more than instinct. In the early 2000s, a small team of paranormal researchers arrived without fanfare. They did not announce themselves to the nearby town or seek permission from anyone. Armed with cameras, recorders, and ironclad skepticism, they crossed onto the property just before dusk. The group joked to mask unease, but the silence of the land seemed to take offense at being mocked. Even before they reached the porch, one of their thermal cameras failed. Another flickered with static, though it carried a full charge. Still, they pressed on, determined to capture what others had only whispered. They managed to force open the front door. It swung inward with the tired sigh of old hinges, as if it had been waiting for pointless defiance. The interior smelled of dust, wood rot, and something faintly metallic, like iron buried underwater. A staircase curved into darkness. The walls, though peeling, held outlines where portraits once hung. As they explored, each of them began to feel the same pressure, as though the house was not content to be observed, but insisted on observing them in return. Their lead investigator placed an audio recorder at the base of the stairs. Within minutes, it picked up a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, like knuckles against wood from somewhere above. One of the team climbed to the 2nd floor despite the air thickening around him. He paused outside a room at the end of the hall, certain he heard breathing on the other side. When he pushed the door open, the room was empty but colder than the air around it, as if someone had left moments before. Downstairs, another member aimed a camera across the parlor. When reviewing footage later, she would find that for a single frame, no more, there appeared to be a figure near the window, translucent, tall, turned slightly away. Not a trick of glare or lens, but something aligned with memory, not light. They continued recording for hours, though none of them acknowledged the muffled piano chord they all heard just after midnight. It wasn't denial, it was instinctual silence, the kind that comes when a person realizes they are no longer visitors but subjects. The team left before dawn, speaking little as they loaded their equipment. Though they attempted to analyze the footage and audio in the weeks that followed, their computers crashed repeatedly, files vanished or corrupted with no pattern. Eventually, each member agreed, without planning, that the project would remain incomplete. They never published their findings. They never returned. One fell ill without explanation. Another abandoned the field entirely. But all of them, when asked in later years, refused to claim the house was empty. Now the mansion stands as it always has, hidden by trees that grew tall around it without permission, its windows reflecting no light that belongs to the living. Those who pass nearby sometimes report the flicker of a lamp in an upstairs room, though no electricity has touched the place in decades. Others claim they hear laughter faint as wind, or footsteps across the porch that start and stop with impossible patience. The truth endures in silence. The house never slept because it was never vacant. Its ghosts are not echoes but residents, rooted deeper than time and untouched by change. It does not seek revenge or mercy, only continuity. Long after those who built it returned to dust, long after the world outside forgot their names, the occupants remain, witnessing without welcome, guarding without grace. And somewhere in its quiet halls, the piano waits for the next night when it feels like remembering.